This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets for you. Some interesting joint venture news coming out of South Africa. The insurance firm Sanlam and MTN, that's the biggest mobile service provider across Africa, they formed a $100 million joint venture. It's designed to sell insurance and savings products in the markets they both operate in. Sanlam shares were largely unchanged on the news. MTN shares, on the other hand, they closed over 4% higher. MTN, in fact, has had a pretty fantastic run so far in 2021. Its share price has risen by over 99% so far in the year. Nigeria's benchmark index, on the other hand, is roughly 2% in the red on a year-to-date basis, even after today's gains. Here's what's coming up tonight. OPEC is forecasting strong world demand for oil this year and in 2022. Ugandan authorities are pegging an economic recovery on a brisk COVID vaccination campaign. And Chinese companies are abandoning plans to list in American capital markets. Let's start the hour in oil markets. A few hours ago, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC as it's more commonly known, left its forecast for growth in oil demand this year and in 2022 pretty much unchanged. And that's despite a surge in Delta variant cases of COVID in some key energy markets. The cartel raised its expectations of supply growth among non-OPEC oil producers too. In its August report, OPEC expects oil demand to go up by around 6 million barrels a day this year to average 96.6 million barrels a day. And that's followed by forecast growth of 3.3 million barrels a day in 2022. Now, non-OPEC supply, on the other hand, is expected to grow by at least 1.1 million barrels a day this year, driven mainly by extra supply coming in from Canada, Russia, China, the United States, Norway and Brazil. OPEC marginally raised its forecast for global GDP growth this year by about 10 basis points to 5.6%, but with the key caveat that assumes the pandemic can be contained. The 2022 outlook was raised by a similar margin to 4.2%. Brent crude was trading above $71 a barrel after that report was released, even as the Biden administration called on OPEC Plus to raise output at a much faster pace.
So today, my director of the National Economic Council has asked the chair of the Federal Trade Commission to use every available tool to monitor the U.S. gasoline market and address any illegal conduct that might be contributing to price increases at the pump while the cost of barrel oil is going down. We're also made clear to OPEC, the major oil exporting nations of the world, that the production cuts made during the pandemic should be reversed as the global economy recovers in order to lower prices for consumers.
All right, then, so let's explore developments in the oil market with Natalie Powell. She joins us on the program tonight. So, Natalie, OPEC Plus have essentially already said, look, we're going to raise output by 400,000 barrels a day every month starting in August with a view to returning that near 6 million barrels of production capacity that's offline. We're going to bring that back to market. But the White House seems to think that's not fast enough. So what sort of production change would the White House like to see?
Well, the US president has stopped short just about of any specifics, but the White House is urging OPEC countries to boost oil production and reverse pandemic-era production cuts. Now, of course, back in April 2020, in the early months of the pandemic, OPEC Plus took the decision to remove almost 10 million barrels per day from the market, and it's currently withholding around 6 million barrels per day, which it plans to gradually return to the market. But of course, the Biden administration says this gradual easing of production cuts is simply not enough in its terms and argues that now is a critical moment in the global recovery. The US is, of course, concerned about increasing fuel costs and a threat that rising inflation could derail the economic recovery from the pandemic. So it is calling on OPEC nations to speed up their oil production process beyond what has currently been agreed.
But those who look at the oil markets will say, look, the US is among the top 3 oil producers in the world. So why is it asking OPEC and its allies to essentially raise output instead of raising output domestically among its own producers?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It certainly seems that US producers have been fairly slow to bring production back online after slowing it down during the height of the pandemic. Now, according to the Energy Information Administration, US production averaged around 11.2 million barrels per day in May, but that is still some way off the 13 million in pre-pandemic times. Not to mention that the president has come under fire for his decision to cancel plans for a phase of the controversial Keystone pipeline after it attracted opposition from environmentalists. And what we're seeing is, with recovery momentum building, demand for petroleum products has returned, and this combined with supply cuts has really pushed up gas prices in the US. And of course the US is the world's largest oil consuming nation, which is of course hitting the wallets of many Americans pretty hard at the moment.
So shale producers in the US have made the most of this ongoing windfall they're seeing in oil prices to pay down debt instead of the breakneck expansion they would have seen in the years past, like the run-up to, say, 2014, for example. What explains that change in stance? Why are shale producers so much more cautious this time round?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of uncertainty from US domestic shale producers at the moment. As you say, their current focus appears to be on cutting costs and less on expansion. The sector is looking towards acquisition and consolidation, especially amid higher drilling budgets. And some analysts also suggest that the long-term demand for oil could fall quite sharply. And the sector is also aware, of course, of President Biden's commitments to cutting fossil fuel consumption. So it's really all of these factors that are tapping into a much more cautious approach from the shale producers.
Indeed. So that leads me to my next question, because back in July, OPEC was arguing, and they still continue to argue even today with their August report, that oil demand will essentially rise by about 3.3 million barrels a day next year. But given the vaccine hesitancy we're seeing in some markets, the rapid spread of the Delta variant, do analysts think that that forecast is still valid?
Well, the Delta variant and, of course, uneven vaccine rates are being closely monitored in terms of the impact that they could have on global oil demand. And analysts are particularly concerned about the COVID-19 strain sapping demand in Asia. Now, interestingly, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has dramatically lowered its oil demand forecast for the rest of this year due to fresh restrictions in high energy consuming countries. And it expects global demand to rise by a further 3.2 million barrels per day in 2022. And of course, there's still uncertainty over potential new variants, for example, and the impact that these could have on oil-consuming nations. So still a lot of uncertainty ahead, even when looking at those forecasts.
Certainly going to be an interesting year as far as our oil markets are concerned. Natalie Powell in London. Thank you. Now, South Sudan's government says it's working to rein in inflation. The IMF is forecasting inflation in Africa's youngest country to average around 40% in 2021. The country's central bank has been providing a lot more hard currency to commercial banks and forex bureaus since April to try and stabilize the country's exchange rate. Here's Patrick Oyet taking up the story from Juba.
Fatah Rahman Adam owns a shop in Juba. He says sales are falling.
The market is not very good. People don't have money. I think many people have not got salaries yet, but the prices are now stable. I think the prices are fair now.
Maize, sorghum, beans and groundnuts are the most important food commodities for many households in South Sudan. However, they are beyond the reach of large numbers of consumers.
The government should come to the market and find out why prices remain high. The local currency has gained against the US dollar, but prices of goods remain high. How can we, the poor, afford food?
The Bank of South Sudan says it is working to stabilize the exchange rate. South Sudan depends significantly on essential commodities imported from neighboring Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan. Importing those commodities require hard currency. South Sudan's central bank received $172 million from the International Monetary Fund to try and stabilize prices. The bank now says it is working to build its own reserves.
The oil prices have been improving, and therefore what we are receiving from the oil revenue is improving also. You are also aware that our own collections from by the National Revenue Authority are improving, and we are collecting good amounts, almost something to the tune of $10 million every month. These dollars are surrendered by the Minister of Finance to the Central Bank to sustain these reforms.
South Sudan's government says its target is for market prices to control the exchange rate and provide lasting stability in commodities. But for many here, the change is taking too long for them to afford basic goods. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Now, High Court in Johannesburg has approved a proposal by the low-cost carrier Mango to go into voluntary business rescue. The court dismissed an application by 3 unions to have Mango, which is a subsidiary of South African Airways, placed in business rescue. Think of it as a form of, say, Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization, but under South African law. Here's CGTN's Sumitra Naidu with the details on what happens next.
The court ruled against the unions and instead agreed to a voluntary business rescue process for the cash-strapped airline.
It appears that the DPE wanted the airline to be liquidated, and let's call them the unions, didn't want that because they would have a much better opportunity to get paid. I think the judge was quite clever in that he made a useful compromise in the sense that he gave a business rescue application, which I think is good for the people, but didn't allow them to control the actual business rescue process, but left it in the hands of the DPE.
Like every other airline, Mango was severely impacted by COVID. The low-cost carrier is still waiting for bailout funds from government and hasn't been able to pay staff.
The real litmus test of the genuine authenticity of how they've conducted themselves in this process will be how soon they release money for staff salaries, how soon they start operations again. So if they really intend to keep Mango around, those two things will happen very quickly.
The Mango Pilots Association, South African Cabin Crew Association and NUMSA wanted the court to place the airline under debt review. They also wanted to collaborate with the board and the airline in the business rescue process. However, now that the High Court has ruled in favor of the airline, the workers and unions have no say in the process.
They've dismissed us as applicants, and they've ordered the CIPC to change Mango's status to in business rescue effective from the 28th of July. Judge hasn't actually given his reasons for the ruling and a breakdown of his judgment as yet. So we're eagerly awaiting to see what is in the ruling.
The unions went into this process expecting transparency from the airline. They also didn't want to see this process going the way SAAs did. That process wrapped up after a year. The unions also believe that while Mango can be saved, some want to see it grounded permanently.
We're very convinced Mango is savable and that it will survive. We've shone a bright spotlight on a number of issues over the last couple of weeks.
Mango has 5 days from the ruling date to announce their business rescue practitioner. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, a quick run through some company news. Let's start in the world of telecommunications. MTN, largest mobile operator in Africa by subscribers, says it lost 2.3 million subscribers in Nigeria after that country's new SIM regulations took effect. Nigeria suspended new SIM registration by network operators last year as the regulator wanted to do a fresh audit of the SIM registration process. The government sought to verify that mobile network operators were following the required standards to register customers' SIM cards. Sanlam and MTN have formed a $100 million joint venture that will see Africa's largest non-bank financial services group partner with the largest mobile operator. Sanlam and MTN are both putting in $50 million each into this 50-50 partnership that will be rolling out insurance and savings products to the continent's rapidly expanding consumer market. Shelter Freak plans to return to the market to raise at least $1.25 billion in local currency bonds by the end of the year. This comes as the Nairobi-based Pan-African mortgage financier emerges from a crippling management crisis that barred it from borrowing from the markets years ago. The mortgage lender intends to mobilize a local currency equivalent of about $500 million each from Nigeria and East Africa, and another $250 million from French-speaking African nations. And the hacker behind one of the largest cryptocurrency heists to date has returned nearly half of the $600 million worth of stolen assets. On the 10th of August, the firm affected, that's Poly Network, wrote an open letter on Twitter asking the individual to get in touch to, quote, work out a solution. The hacker then posted messages pledging to return the funds, claiming to be not very interested in the money. Poly Network says it's gotten about $260 million back so far. That's a run through your company headlines. We're about 15 minutes into the hour. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. Authorities in Uganda pegging an economic recovery on how fast they can roll out COVID-19 vaccines. And we'll explore why SMEs in Nigeria still struggle to get any credit from banks. The details coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Uganda. Across the globe, access to COVID-19 vaccines is enabling countries to reopen their economies and get back to semblance of normalcy, especially after 18 months of pandemic-induced shutdowns. But across Africa, though, critically low vaccine supply is proving to be a much bigger barrier to a desperately needed economic recovery. And analysts are arguing that in some countries, like Uganda, vaccines will do little to revive economic activity unless they're complemented with fiscal reforms. From Kampala, here's CGTN's Michael Baleke.
Uganda is coming out of a more deadly second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 2,800 people have died from the virus. But the pandemic has also left the economy on its knees and struggling to stay afloat.
We've learned from Ministry of Finance that they're experiencing roughly 40% shortfall in domestic revenue collection. This is significant because the financial year has just started. So it means this can actually increase to close to 50 or 60%.
Uganda's president has partially lifted the country's second lockdown, allowing businesses and public transport to reopen. However, the signs of economic recovery remain modest. The government's strategy is to inoculate at least 22 million people, a move authorities believe will reduce severe disease but also concentrate more resources towards salvaging the economy.
The only way we can all return back to what seems to be normal life is after vaccination and observance of the standard operating procedures.
More than 1.1 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered in Uganda so far. Like many other African countries, Uganda is struggling to secure enough vaccines to inoculate its target population of 22 million people. But economic analysts argue that getting jabs into people's arms will not address all the challenges facing the economy.
We need to think a bit longer term, in the medium term, of how to overhaul the economy, putting some resources in the real economy, in agriculture, in agro-processing, strengthening backward and forward linkages.
Even before the pandemic, Uganda's economy was on shaky ground. The border closure, following a diplomatic row with Rwanda, the Kenya trade wars, and the insecurity in South Sudan and the eastern DR Congo have affected the country's export earnings. Uganda's tightly controlled response to the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have paid off in terms of physical health, with the numbers of new infections coming down to 100 compared to over 1,000 per day a couple of months ago. But the continuous lockdown measures have not been good for people's economic health. They are believed to be driving more people into severe poverty. According to the World Bank, global extreme poverty is expected to rise this year, with the COVID-19 pandemic pushing an additional 150 million people into extreme poverty, especially in low-income countries like Uganda.
We need to address issues of production, productivity, issues of markets.
Unfortunately, Uganda, like other African countries, has what we call a limited fiscal space. It doesn't have sufficient money to do what is necessary. So if you talk about a liquidity program, for instance, to support businesses, you find that you just can't support everyone.
While Uganda's economic outlook remains uncertain due to the unpredictable path of the pandemic, the government says getting more jobs into arms is essential if economic growth is to return to its full potential. Michael Baleke, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
In Kenya, demand for medical-grade oxygen has risen sharply due to a surge in COVID-19 infections. By the 11th of August, the country had over 1,800 patients admitted to various health facilities. 7% of those were on ventilatory support. Now, for patients like these, getting a steady quality supply of oxygen is a challenge, given that there aren't many producers of that gas in the country. But one firm, Hewa Tele, is helping to solve that problem, as CGTN's Wanja Mungai now reports.
Kenyan Walter Otieno is working hard to hit a target. He's an employee at Hewa Tele, an oxygen production farm in Nairobi, Kenya's capital. The company has been trying to meet the rising demand for oxygen from its client, mainly hospitals. For the farm, the coronavirus pandemic has meant more work as orders increase daily. Hewa Tele is now aiming at doubling production from 410 tons to 880 tons to meet the demand.
We use our manifold system, which takes 10 cylinders at a time. So that is called a batch. Every batch, we have to fix 10 cylinders of different sizes. When it's 8.5, the bigger one, the smaller one, all of them must be 10 at a time.
Kenya is currently experiencing a fourth wave of the coronavirus pandemic, driven by the highly contagious Delta variant. Hewa Tele is currently supplying 200 hospitals across the country. According to Otieno, that calls for proper hygiene during production.
The first few things which we check are ensure the cylinders are clean. The cylinders which are dirty, we send them outside to the cylinder bay where we wash them. And also we do disinfection.
Hewa Tele is a Swahili word for lots of air. And in keeping with the company's name, the farm works towards increasing capacity, enhancing availability and affordability. The management has also decentralized the manufacturing process.
We do production close to where oxygen is needed. That allows us to lower the costs of transportation. And then we have a simplified milkman distribution model where we bring oxygen to a network of hospitals around the primary facility where the production is done to bridge that oxygen gap.
Average, our price is about 30% below the average market prices. So for government hospitals, our prices are pretty reasonable between $19 and $25 per cylinder of 8.5 cubic, as compared to the average market price of about $35 to $40 for a similar size. The reason why we have kept it low is because our mission, our organization mission, enables us to do that. We would like to ensure that there is more reliable quality oxygen available, but then at the same time affordable.
Hewatele is among the few liquid oxygen producers in the East African country. It hopes to pump in $3.5 million by end of the year and another $1.5 million in 2022. This is to increase its production capacity. The investment will hopefully help meet the ever-increasing demand for oxygen during this pandemic. Wanjamungai, CGTN.
On to West Africa, Nigeria's Credit Bureau Association says just 4% of the 40 million micro, small, medium-sized enterprises in Africa's largest economy have access to credit from formal financial institutions, and that despite years of efforts by the government through the central bank to make credit far more accessible for these small firms. CGTN's Phil Ihaza explores this disconnect from Abuja.
Nura Abdullahi has been a laundryman for 3 years, but is unable to expand his business due to lack of funds. He says he's been unsuccessful accessing credit from banks.
I need money to make my business move, to buy washing machines, dryers, industrial irons. But when I approached some banks, they said I don't have bank accounts, history of transactions and collateral to get any loan.
It's the same challenge for millions of small-scale entrepreneurs, especially in rural areas across Nigeria. 96% of them are caught up in the credit crunch, according to the Credit Bureau Association of Nigeria. A microfinance outfit called OG Capital is trying to help. It's providing loans to traders at the bottom of the microcredit pyramid, as well as offering help to manage their businesses so they can be more productive and pay back the debts easily.
We charge them daily interest rates because we understand that most of them even earn on a daily, so that they are not feeling overwhelmed with the plenty bulk things that come with going to the bank to get money, and then it's with little or no papers. So we use guarantor system. That's like people within your social economy, maybe your neighbor, your family, your church, to use you to be your guarantors. And because I know that you don't want to fail your pastor, you will pay my money. So we dwell on it, and it's been very effective.
According to the Small and Medium Enterprises Development Agency of Nigeria, SMEs make up about 50% of the country's GDP and are responsible for nearly 60 million jobs.
Without assistance like this, the growth of Nigeria's economy at the grassroots level could be hampered. These small-scale entrepreneurs would find it difficult to stay afloat.
In March, the government secured a loan from the Bank of Industry of $1 billion to support SMEs in the country. But experts say the government will need to create an enabling environment for the microfinance industry so that more funds can be disbursed.
For a country of 200 million, there has to be at least 10 million microfinance companies, right? We need more people in the microfinance industry to provide access to funding. The industry needs to become more competitive. Microfinance companies need to do more for people, and there will not be an ability to do more if there is not enough of us, right? We need to have a lot more access to capital from CBN, that's the Central Bank of Nigeria. We need to have access to technology to allow us to relief in terms of tax.
The government says so far it has disbursed about $120 each to 25,000 micro-entrepreneurs as part of its conditional cash transfer program. It has pledged to support more SMEs like Nura's to iron out problems in their businesses. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has admitted that the wealthy Gupta family's influence over appointments not just in government but also in state-owned enterprises was neither detected nor addressed until it was too late. Mr. Ramaphosa says that leaders were caught off guard by the fact that the Guptas were friends with the then leader of the governing African National Congress Party, Jacob Zuma. Ramaphosa made those comments when he appeared before the State Capture Commission. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela was there.
President Cyril Ramaphosa is wrapping up his testimony at the country's long-running corruption inquiry. He's testifying in his capacity as both the former deputy and now president of the country. The commission is probing the alleged mass looting of state coffers during former President Jacob Zuma's 9-year presidency. At the center of the corruption accusations are allegations that Zuma was influenced by the Guptas, a wealthy South African family, in looting state money and influencing government policy. Ramaphosa was questioned about why those in power did not take action against the Gupta family.
I think we were blindsided by the fact that this family were friends to the ultimate leader of our party. And that blindsided us. We were blindsided by the fact that these were friends of the president.
Ramaphosa confirmed that he believes state capture exists as a well-organized project that influenced policy and legal processes. Thursday's proceedings, however, largely focused on state security. Following the deadly civil unrest that engulfed parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces in July, questions were raised about the failure of the intelligence community to prevent or preempt the violence. In response to this, Ramaphosa last week announced sweeping changes to the cabinet and placed the State Security Agency in the presidency.
Many people have misunderstood it. Chairperson, they've even gone to an extent of saying the president is now creating a super presidency. And others have gone on to say this is now the emergence of a dictatorship. Others are saying we are becoming a totalitarian state. Far be it from it. All we are seeking to do to this very important entity of government is to realign it, to repurpose it.
Ramaphosa also told the commission that reports and evidence that the state security had an unvetted private army working for Jacob Zuma were being investigated. He says this was one of the reasons for moving the State Security Agency to the presidency.
And it is an agency that has been docked with a lot of controversy and trouble. And as I said earlier, it's got a lot of good people in it. And we just need to realign its work properly with the objectives of our developmental state.
Ramaphosa is the last witness to give oral evidence to the commission. After his appearance, Commission Chair Judge Raymond Zondo will compile a report and hand it over to relevant authorities. Yulisa Njabela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to North Africa now. Tunisia has reported a 14% rise in grain collected over the first 7 months of 2021. According to data from the country's grain office, Tunisia harvested over 810,000 tons of grain, buoyed by increased output. From Tunis, CGTN's Alan Chouachi has the details.
The quantities of grain collected represent 49% of production, estimated at 16.4 million quintals, and 70% for durum wheat. The Ministry of Agriculture announced that no quantities were damaged during the collection, despite the significant output, and specified that the distribution process started in the first week of June.
The collection of this year's harvest is going smoothly. No quantities were damaged during the collection and storage in the grain office silos and the distribution to the mills. We've managed to collect and preserve outdoor grain piles until the final collection. Now there are no grain quantities in the open air.
The CEO of the National Grain Office noted that the authorities have prepared the strategic reserves of flour and semolina.
The strategic reserves of grain in Tunisia covers the consumption. The distribution is happening normally nationwide. There are 24 public mills which provide the much-needed quantities of flour to the population. The semolina and pasta are available until January 2022.
According to the National Institute of Statistics, Tunisia imports more than 60% of its wheat to meet the country's demand. In 2019, the customs services seized tons of imported grain, which the health department experts described as carcinogenic. President Kais Saied has warned that the state will no longer tolerate the import of grains which are not fit for human consumption.
There's no room to waste a single grain of wheat or barley. There's also no room for what happened in the previous years, like the import of carcinogenic wheat. There have been many instances and irregularities concerning imported wheat, which have occurred and could have caused cancer for Tunisian consumers. This will not happen again.
The National Grain Office revealed that Tunisia's grain harvest fell 35% in 2020 due to a long dry spell. The North African state has been boosting production to achieve self-sufficiency. According to the Agriculture Department, rainfall deficit and scarcity of water resources in Tunisia could have a negative impact on crop harvest in the next season. Local farmers urged the authorities to preserve the grain harvest this summer. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Still in North Africa, Egypt's West Bakr wind farm has synchronized the first 20 turbines to the national grid. Now, the wind farm will have an installed generation capacity of about 250 megawatts once it's completed later this year. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim exploring Egypt's progress in investing in clean, renewable energy to meet a growing energy demand in the North African state.
This is a milestone for Egypt's plans to induce wind energy in its electricity grid. Lakaila's West Badr project is one of 4 wind farms in Egypt, but the first to produce clean energy for electricity. The 20 turbines at West Badr wind farm are the first stage of an expected total output of 250 megawatts.
Most of the wind farms are located along the Gulf of Suez because the wind speed exceeds 10 meters per second. Less than 4 meters per second would not generate power. Turbines can work at over 4 meters per second, but the big turbines will work on speeds above 10 meters per second. The West Bakri project is meant to reach 96 turbines, with each turbine set to produce 2.6 megawatts, which is the biggest size turbine in Egypt.
Egypt depends on hydropower from the Nile and the High Dam to produce a maximum 2.8 gigawatt for its energy needs. The government has been providing incentives for investors to help reach the target of 42% of power from solar and wind energy by 2035. But experts believe the country can easily exceed that target.
In solar energy, the infrastructure, current technology, climate and land we have now, if it's fully utilized, we will produce about 55 gigawatts. This is 1.5 times bigger than the total electricity grid of Egypt, without even counting the wind energy output. Investing in electricity in Egypt is very profitable because of the lucrative pricing system for energy providers. In addition, all hurdles have been lifted as the president himself monitors energy projects to make sure there are no obstacles for investors.
Experts say there is already a 25% surplus in electricity supply. Egypt needs to save 15% to meet a surge in demand, and the rest can be exported to create foreign currency revenue. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for another break. Here's what's coming up. Chinese firms are abandoning plans to tap into American capital markets. We'll explore what's driving this trend. We'll also be taking a deeper look at the impact of the $1 trillion U.S. infrastructure program when we return. This has taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time, it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Over the last 14 hours of rain.
Welcome back to the program. These are some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. The United Nations has been expressing concern over fresh displacement from fighting in Ethiopia's Amhara and Afar regions. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's office has given a media briefing today, saying more aid trucks have gained access to the Tigray region. The press secretary, Bilene Seyum, also dismissed reports of an alliance between the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army. In North Africa, Libya to be specific, Khalifa Haftar, the commander of the eastern-based Libyan National Army, says his troops will not follow orders from any other authority in the North African state. He announced this in a speech to mark the 81st anniversary of the founding of Libya's armed forces. Haftar has also reshuffled the commanding officers of his forces, a move that Libya's presidency council has rejected. The number of people going hungry in Nigeria continues to rise due to the rising cost of living and regional insecurity. That's according to the United Nations, which says that in the last 12 years, some 350,000 people have been killed and another 2 million displaced by a brutal insurgency in the northeast of the country. Inflation in Nigeria also hit a 4-year peak in the first quarter of 2021. It's remained high ever since. And finally, Zambians have been casting ballots in presidential and parliamentary elections today. The Thursday polls started at 6 a.m. local time. They were preceded by a tense campaign period in the middle of major economic challenges and the coronavirus pandemic. The incumbent President Edgar Lungu and his longtime rival Hakainde Hichilema are expected to be the frontrunners in the presidential race. That's a run through your headlines. Well, times certainly are changing, and so are the listing plans of Chinese firms. Many companies that had flocked for decades to American capital markets in order to raise funds are now planning to do so instead in closer home markets in order to hedge against policy uncertainty on both sides of the Pacific. The EV car maker Li Auto is the most recent example of this change in course, as Xie Cheng now reports.
Chinese electric vehicle maker Li Auto has raised 11.8 billion Hong Kong dollars or $1.5 billion US dollars from a secondary listing that received passionate support from investors. Li Auto is also among a group of US-listed Chinese companies looking to raise money closer to home. Alibaba, NetEase, and JD.com all have carried out secondary listings. Doing a secondary listing in Hong Kong also helps to hedge against some of the geopolitical risk that has spilled over into financial market regulation. Earlier this year, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission adopted rules that impose stricter auditing requirements for foreign firms listed in the U.S. Those requirements carry the threat of delisting for companies that break the rules. And last month, the SEC also said it will require additional disclosures from Chinese companies looking to list on U.S. exchanges. One analyst says it's a good time for these Chinese companies to return home.
For those Chinese companies who currently list in the U.S., probably there will be increasing trend for them to come back to A shares or H shares to list in the next few years at least. Besides the rising external uncertainties, what we see is the A shares market has been much more opening compared to the past. So at this moment, I think if the companies even listing in the H shares, it will be much easier for the A shares investor to invest in these stocks. So besides the financial market, on the economic side, one of the key things in the dual circulation policy is to boost the domestic demand. So it will be also an advantage for those companies who decide to come back and list and choose to list in the home.
The most practical issue is whether these repatriating companies' businesses will be affected.
Overall, there will be more opportunities for those Chinese companies who decide to come back to A shares or H shares to list. It will be much easier for them to promote the branding and the business models in the regions because the Chinese investors are more familiar with them compared to the US investors. So the liquidities in these stocks are expected to improve in the coming few years. And also on the other hand, in these areas, the tech sectors, actually the growth room actually are much more substantial compared to the other region because this is also one of the key areas the policymakers trying to grow. But the challenging side will be the valuations for these companies probably would be much or slightly higher compared to the peers. But this is also one of the opportunity is that keep pushing them to come up with the revenues to matching with their valuations.
So in general, analysts believe that there's an increasing trend for foreign-listed Chinese companies to come back to Hong Kong or the Chinese mainland market. And it could be good news for the tech sector, which needs strong financial support from investors to innovate. Xia Cheng, CGTN.
Now, the Biden administration is celebrating what it considers to be a historic piece of legislation that aims to completely overhaul American infrastructure. The $1 trillion spending plan was passed by the Senate with rare bipartisan support. Now, while some Democrats are toasting to this brief expression of bipartisan unity, it's likely to be severely tested with another proposal that will cost 3 times as much. On Fairclough takes up that story.
A victory lap for Joe Biden, who became US president with a pledge to build bridges both literally and ideologically.
Now is the moment to put in place the long-term plan to build back America better.
Senators passed this $1 trillion upgrade of American infrastructure with bipartisan support amid the most polarized political climate on record.
Our Republican colleagues have argued that long-term investments in physical infrastructure will grow the economy and reduce inflationary pressures. And I thank them for that. They're exactly right. We agree on that.
But the lower House of Representatives still needs to approve the bill, and its Democrat leader isn't quite as effusive.
I'm glad it passed. I'm glad it's bipartisan, strongly so, important to job creation and the rest. But it is not the totality of the vision of Joe Biden and the congressional Democrats.
That vision includes a supplementary $3.5 trillion over 10 years, invested in sectors such as health and family services, as well as protecting the environment. The Democrat-led Senate voted for the blueprint, but perhaps ominously without Republican support. And this puts lawmakers back in familiar territory. Republicans accusing Democrats of reckless spending amid alarm bells over the government's debt and concern that it will run out of money to function in just a few months' time. Speaker Nancy Pelosi says her Democrats won't sign off on that infrastructure bill unless there's agreement over that much more expensive and expansive successor that even some Democrats don't support, much less their Republican opponents. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
The Thai baht, once the best performing currency in Asia, has fallen steadily this year as tourism spending has declined sharply due, of course, to the COVID-19 pandemic and all the related economic losses. Consequently, it's become one of the worst hit currencies in the region. Martin Low in Bangkok has this report.
With substantial cash reserves and low inflation, Thailand's currency, the baht, was a solid bet, one of Asia's strongest currencies pre-pandemic. But its value has plummeted to become the region's worst performer. It's because 15 to 20% of Thailand's national wealth comes from tourism. And with borders closed for almost 18 months, that income has faded like footsteps in the sand. In just a year, Thailand's current account went from a $40 billion surplus to more than $2 billion in the red.
We need to control COVID-19 outbreak, and then we can open our country for foreign tourists. In export sector, we do quite well, but we need to be careful about the infected worker. In that will be a key factor for Thailand recovery and also baht recovery.
It's why schemes like the Phuket Sandbox are being tried to give life support to a tourism industry that once brought Thailand 40 million high-spending foreign visitors a year. But a target to reopen the country by October looks out of reach, with rates of infection topping 20,000 daily and lockdowns affecting work, entertainment and travel. Ironically, there used to be concerns that the Thai baht was too strong, making the country's exports expensive on world markets. But COVID-19 has brought a remarkable reversal in its fortunes. According to financial data, the baht has fallen in value by 10% against the US dollar over the past 12 months. Though not alone, it's the biggest drop in major Asian currencies. The Japanese yen is down 7%, the Malaysian ringgit 5%, and the Australian dollar 4.4%. Japanese bank Mizuho described the baht's poor performance as uncharacteristic because it seemed so well protected. Some are saying it demonstrates an over-reliance by Thailand on the tourism sector. But one benefit is Thai exports are now cheaper and could continue a recent rise. Martin Lowe, CGTN, Bangkok.
Shanghai's Pudong New area is considered to be a key part of China's socio-economic development. It's got high-end tech firms and many core industries located there. But it's also become a place for people to enjoy life, to let their hair down, have a good time. And the district is hoping that its entertainment landscape will help expand domestic spending, particularly during the pandemic. Chen Tong has the details on what's hot.
When it comes to entertainment, Shanghai Disneyland is one of the biggest attractions in Pudong. Its popularity among Chinese tourists has inspired Disneyland to expand its services in the domestic market. In 2019, the resort announced plans to build its first ever Zootopia-themed entertainment park, based on the popular animation of the same name. No specific details about plans have been announced just yet. But with Pudong clear about its ambitions, Disney says it's ready and willing to contribute to the efforts.
So we're very happy to be partnering in this community. And if we can help Pudong continue to be a pioneer zone through what we can bring as Disney, if we can marry those two together, we think this whole area will be very successful.
Disney is just one element in Shanghai's international resort, a huge area that includes a shopping village and has plans to expand into the movie industry with a film industrial park. Next to Disneyland is Shanghai Village, with a shopping outlet featuring more than 200 boutique shops. It's clear both domestic and foreign brands are competing to attract attention of Chinese wallets.
If you are a shopaholic, you will fall in love with this place. You can find new designs at cheaper prices. And this village in Pudong aims to build itself into a global consumer center.
While the pandemic has suspended global tourism, the shopping village is finding opportunities in other ways. In 2020, 50 new brands opened stores in the village. Consumption levels recorded triple-digit growth in the first half of the year, an increase on the year before.
We start to see visitors arriving from other big cities around China because it's a voyage of discovery. Everybody's revisited their hometowns 100 times over the last 18 months and have visited things that they hadn't seen for a long time.
Thanks to Disney and Shanghai Village, more than 85 million tourists have contributed $6 billion to the resort since the establishment 5 years ago.
Our resort is only 15 minutes ride from the future transportation hub of Pudong. It will open to international tourists and tourists from the Yangtze River Delta region. The great location will play an important role in dual circulation. We hope to attract domestic and foreign tourists to stay in Pudong.
The Shanghai International Resort has bigger ambitions. By the end of 2025, it hopes to welcome more than 25 million tourists every year. And when it does, the whole resort is expected to cover a total area of some 25 square kilometers. Chen Tong, CGTN, Shanghai.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices. So oil demand outlooks are our focus. They came in from OPEC and the IEA today, and they could not be more different, for lack of a better word. The IEA made a bear case between the two of them, arguing essentially that the spread of the Delta variant of COVID is eroding demand at a pretty rapid clip. The Biden administration, as mentioned earlier in the hour, they've asked OPEC to raise oil output at a much faster rate than the 400,000 barrels a day per month that they have at the moment. But some in the country hold a different view. Texas Governor Greg Abbott actually took to Twitter to make an argument that an oil output rise is something that can be done by American producers. Roughly 4 out of every 10 barrels of crude in the U.S. does come from the state of Texas. Here's what's coming up next. South Africa's unique caffeine-free tea joins champagne on the EU protection list. welcome back. Let's jump into the world of beverages, shall we? Rooibos tea is gaining popularity around the world. It's been consumed across Southern Africa for centuries, but it's now becoming a favorite beverage around the world. Rooibos is also the first food from the African continent to get approval for international protection from the EU. As CGTN's Nokutula Shabalala now explores, that places Rooibos in the same league as champagne, feta cheese and Irish whiskey.
The winter rains have begun in South Africa's Western Cape, and workers here at this Rooibos farm province are already busy planting seedlings.
Just like champagne is unique to France, so too is Rooibos in this area where it grows traditionally, making it unique to South Africa, especially this area in the Western Cape.
Rooibos, roughly translated to red bush in Afrikaans, the language of South Africa's earliest European settlers. Grown only in South Africa's Western Cape province, the naturally caffeine-free tea used to be a specialist drink appealing to only some taste buds. But in recent years, its refreshing taste and inviting aroma, coupled with its health benefits, have turned Rooibos into a popular choice for tea lovers across the world.
Rooibos has a fantastic, story. I mean, if you've been out to see where it's grown in Cederberg Mountains, it's really hot, sandy. It's an amazing looking bush. It looks to me like a rosemary bush. So who's growing it, where it's grown, the stories around that, the environment and the community where it's grown. That's one of the things we look for. Obviously, taste, and I mean, Rooibos is fantastic. It's got this wonderful, soothing, calming flavour to it, quite sweet.
The increasing popularity of Rooibos has created an industry worth around $23 billion. Some 15,000 tons of Rooibos are harvested every year in South Africa. And at least half of that is then exported to the increasingly health-conscious consumers. Germany, Japan and the Netherlands remain the largest importers of Rooibos, closely followed by the UK and the US.
What makes Rooibos unique is that it is present in an area that is very small and remote. The fact that it grows here naturally makes it unique. The other thing is that it is a very healthy product. It is caffeine-free and has many health benefits.
Joining the likes of champagne to Kalamata olives, the European Union recently added South Africa's Rooibos tea to its list of protected agricultural products and foodstuffs. The iconic tea is the first African product to receive such status in the EU. And back in the Western Cape province, Rooibos farmers like Zandberg hope that the move will boost demand and improve the crop's profitability. Nokutula Shabalala, CGTN.
And that story about that lovely red tea wraps up this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the programme in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang, the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today's up next from Washington.